Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Dario Linares, and of course, it's always a pleasure to speak to my good friend Neil Fox. How you doing, Neil?
Very well, thank you. Hello, listeners. Hello, Dario. Yeah, it's Friday afternoon, which has become our kind of preferred recording time, haven't they? Which is nice. It kind of leaps us into the weekend.
I like to say that this is, due to fantastically organised scheduling, but usually it's just a case of, we've fallen into Friday and just managed to get to the end of the week. Should we tape? Yeah, go on then.
But it always drags us.
It always works. Yeah.
We're always pulled back from the precipice by the podcast.
Yeah.
And alliteration.
Sure. You seen anything over the week, Neil, that you just wanted to quickly mention at all?
Yeah, but it's TV.
Go on then.
I'm not sure if I'm allowed. But it has got film context. So It's the TV show Documentary Now. Have you ever seen this?
I don't think so.
So I watched a couple of episodes for my book because it's a Saturday Night Live offshoot thing. So it was developed by Bill Hader and Fred Armisen, and they're 30-minute episodes, but they are kind of spoof documentaries in the vein of documentaries that you know.
Okay.
So the first episode is like a Grey Garden spoof, and then episode 2 is both a kind of spoof of Nanook of the North, and then a documentary about the controversies of how they shot Nanook of the North, and that it wasn't a documentary. So it kind of takes these very, very established forms like Don't Look Back, or I just watched one which was like Primary. Was it Primary? No, The War Room. So it's kind of like The War Room, but it's like this kind of war room spoof, but set in a kind of Ohio gubernatorial midterm. It's just hilarious.
Yeah.
So it's really, really well made, really, really funny, but really kind of knows. Oh, and that was it, because I was talking to someone who'd mentioned that, asked if I'd seen the one which is from season 4, which is a kind of Les Blanc Burden of Dreams one with Alexander Skarsgård playing a Werner Herzog type director.
Okay.
It's brilliant.
Okay.
It's absolutely brilliant.
This sounds great.
It's great. So I watched that, and then I went back to the start, because I was like, I only watched the music ones for the book.
Okay.
So I kind of started at the start. There's 4 seasons. They're all short episodes, and they're all on ITVX.
Okay. What's the overall title again? Sorry.
It's called Documentary Now.
Documentary Now.
That's the name of the series. Yeah, it's really. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's really, really good. So it's very filmy.
Yeah.
It's a TV show.
Yeah. It sounds like it's part of this sort of zeitgeist of what is documentary doing these days. It's because life is just hitting us all the time. It's like there isn't that time to breathe anymore and sit back and go, okay, let's piece this thing together. What was the truth of this event? And because it's like, when you've got, I hate to sort of keep referencing, the Orange Overlord, but it's like, this is a guy who changes his mind every few hours, it seems, and it's like, how could you shape a kind of the documentary form around a figure like that? It's kind of pointless, really, in a sense, and it links to obviously some of the underpinnings to today's conversation. Just very quickly, I just wanted to mention before we get to that, I rewatched Tar this week, which was really interesting. It was just one of those things where I can't remember, just an intuitive pick where I was sort of going through. I want something that I know is a film. Oh, that was it. It was because I was just reading and writing a little bit about how tired I was of the Oscar conversation, and how I just thought film culture and film discussion has kind of congealed over the last 3 weeks. And I want to watch something where I know that there's been discourse on this, but it's been a while ago, but it's still a proper film, and it really is an interesting psychological movie, and ties into still a lot of the stuff that we've been discussing around education as well, because we've just been having some conversations around that for an upcoming episode. And Cate Blanchett is just fantastic, and she's in London on the theatre at the moment, so I'm going to try and get some last minute tickets at some point. But just somebody who can, like, again, it's a very physical performance, and I wrote a little bit on the film as part of this month's newsletter, so that's just gone up, because I wrote a little bit about Gene Hackman as a sort of embodied character, which is not something maybe that people sort of think of him in that way, but I think he's very much a kind of a physical presence as much as a psychological actor and a character actor in that sense. So I'm sort of writing about it in those terms. So if you want to read that, then please go over to our Patreon. There's loads of our extra content if you sign up as a member. Our very reasonable rate for everything is up for all of the content that you get up there.
Yes, congealed is a great word, isn't it? It's really nicely
Yes.
used. And again, I think part of the reason for putting this episode out is a kind of a gentle pushback against the ways that some of the film has come to be talked about or considered or thought about in a lot of spaces. So today's episode is a kind of talk by Rod Stoneman, who came down to Falmouth. Some of you might be aware, a couple of years ago, we put out a talk by Laura Mulvey for when Laura and Rod came to Falmouth for a weekend, and we put out Rod's contribution to that event on as a bonus episode, actually, on the main feed, just on the website, I think it was in the end. But when sort of Rod was pitching a talk for students, I just kind of got excited to hear it. It's so that Rod's talk was called Amongst Artistic Forms of Thought, and was just sort of thinking through how form, and particularly radical form, can do kind of really important work in terms of engaging audiences in thinking, and how we can access thinking by artists or kind of filmmakers. And his talks covered Goddard, Adam Curtis, Amy Hardy, and others, including a kind of extended section.
Malcolm Le Grice,
who passed away in December. So again, I was thinking, well, actually, we get to kind of have that conversation on the pod as well. So yeah, it was, and we haven't been around for a couple of weeks because of bits and pieces going on. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to share something which was very, very different to kind of the regular discourse, but also in the way that we like to, very, very different from the Mario Van Peebles episode. We like to try and push as far in a different direction, with each episode to kind of engage different parts of our brains and your brains, listeners, as well. So yeah, that's going to be the focus of this episode.
Yeah, and just listening to it this morning, actually, it's amazing to me how much this kind of fitted into my thinking, particularly on the back of doing this teaching on editing and montage with first-year undergrads, and trying to sort of articulate some of these ideas, particularly around experimental montage and the engagement with form itself over content, form as the meaning rather than the content, which is a very difficult thing to kind of get across. Not the students' fault, again, just because they're so mired in narrative and interpretation, and getting people to think outside of that is very hard. I mean, we find it, it's challenging at the best of times, but I think this is a really fascinating piece of oratory in that sense. I really enjoyed the links and some of the quotations, which I'm going to pilfer, giving reference, of course, but I think there's some really fantastic kind of little nuggets of conceptual rhetoric, let's say, that allows you to think about certain ways that we relate to art. And also, I mean, it really got me thinking about my own relationship to what I would call mainstream culture, and why, for example, like the encountering sort of some of the Oscar films and just being so disappointed. Not disappointed. I mean, it's a silly word, really, but kind of like unable to really engage with them beyond like, this is a 2-3 star. Yeah, I know exactly what it's doing. I'm completely uninterested. And therefore, what kind of film culture do I want? What do I want to engage with? What's the point in it for me if this is 99% of the way that film is these days? It really sort of made me sort of reflect on that a little bit.
Great. That was the hope in sharing it in this space. So I'm glad that is one of the outcomes, and look forward to hearing more from you in our bit at the end. So yeah, on the show notes there are links to all of the work that's kind of referenced and cited in Rod's talk, and links to actually see some of that stuff where available. But yeah, massive thanks to Rod for not only coming down and sort of delivering the talk, but for agreeing to let us put it out. So yeah, this is Rod Stoneman and Amongst Artistic Forms of Thought. Well, thank you for coming to this talk by Rod Stoneman. Rod has a long association with the Southwest, being raised in Torquay, and working a variety of experimental and artist film and political film programming and touring and teaching. And in 2023, Rod came back to Falmouth for the first time in 45 years with a program that he delivered in 1978 with Laura Mulvey. Some of you may know her work. And we hosted that here. It was called the Falmouth Film Weekend. Now we revisited the 1978 program with some new additions as myself. It was basically a weekend of seminars around experimental film, artist moving image, and kind of the distance travel between 1978 and 2023. It was a wonderful weekend. And then we've just been sort of further developing sort of working relationship, apprenticeship around Rod's time at the Independent Film and Video Department at Channel 4 from 1982 to 1993, I want to say. Is that, I mean,
yeah, that's right. Channel 4 from the beginning to 93. What was that? Maybe it was 94. Yeah.
Yeah. A period of kind of really kind of intense political and cultural, social challenge in Britain, and kind of a state-funded, majority state-funded broadcaster with a department which Rod was one of the commissioning editors for, which was responsible for making and screening some really just fairly innovative cinematic work, screen television, including Handsworth Songs by the Black Audio Film Collective, and a number of seasons which were kind of in direct contrast to the kind of the modern, the kind of the, what's the words, the dominant qualities in Britain at the time. But that is just a small part of Rod's background. And we're working with Rod, the university, and myself and a colleague, Victoria Bayard, television, working with Rod, another of the commissioning editors, Caroline, and the University of Bristol, on a project to kind of restore that work and make it available, which is a considerable body of kind of screen work, which is very exciting. And we've had a number of conversations about culture, politics, art, cinema over the last few years. So it would be a really nice opportunity to get Rod back to share some of his thoughts on all of those things. But he's kindly agreed to put together this talk, which I think is called Amongst Artistic Forms of Thought.
I'll explain where that strange title comes from, maybe. But,
great. So I'll turn it over to you now, Rod.
Okay.
If that was a suitable intro.
Yep, that's perfect. I mean, I think it's probably helpful to say the shape and structure of this would be, about an hour, maybe a little bit more than an hour on that address, Artistic Forms of Thought, followed by something which sort of segues into it about a Southwest filmmaker, actually, you could say in a way, Malcolm Le Grice, who was born in Plymouth and eventually came back to Thurleston near Kingsbridge in retirement, and whose filmmaking, is a particular version of the kind of experiment that falls within the parameters of different forms of thought, if you like. And sad to say, he passed away in December last year. Although, if you say sad, it's also he was 84, so he had a good, and kept on making films up there in Thurleston. He's meant to be retired, but he still couldn't stop himself making new films. In fact, the one we'll end on was made just before he died. He couldn't stop it. I also wanted to say that, there are a few ideas I'm going to throw out, but also we're going to look at some fun, what I think are interesting films to watch. And also that I don't have any problem with someone saying, look, let's talk about that, or what did you mean by that, or surely the opposite is actually true. And I don't know, the focus is on different types of radical form to be found in artistic interventions. When I was at University of Galway, setting up a kind of film school enterprise there. One of the feisty students who I used to notice writing down all the Godard quotes that I came up with, and I thought, oh well, maybe he'll make films. And he did. He's made about 4 music films. Niall McCann, and his first film was a music documentary about Brit pop with the noticeable title, "Can Art Save the World?" And the question of saving the world is something that filmmakers sometimes talk about. And I think, I don't know, reading the Guardian online on my phone on the train coming here this morning, Baudelaire in the late 19th century said, every time I open the newspapers, hiya, it's a tissue of horrors. And I think, that sort of is not so different at the moment. And so a thing about artistic forms of thought, I want to say, is that, clearly, in my mind, we need a pluralism whereby artistic forms of thought, which may need more or less effort to look at and think about, sit alongside, more traditional, simple forms of thought. I mean, when yesterday Trump speaks to Congress, and quite apart from his politics, let's leave it there, he also makes about 10 factual errors. And then it's worse than that. He's repeating 10 factual errors because they've been in previous speeches and he's been corrected. And that does need simple refutation, in my opinion. So looking at what artists and filmmakers do is one thread of discourse, which complements other threads of discourse. I don't think we're going to get every Guardian. Actually, I did a obituary for Malcolm Le Grice, and clearly the Guardian liked the idea of it, but they found there wasn't enough narrative in it for them somehow, and they kept on saying, "Where's the story here?" and this sort of thing. I think when I was first, the title comes from an article I wrote about one of Godard's first films, Numéro 2, which was in 1981, and that was part of what people were talking about then, which was coming from French theory, from Paris into British film culture, a bit of a bumpy ride, but often how meaning is made. How do people understand works of art? And I was delighted to find a really earlier version of this in a little half-an-hour talk that Marcel Duchamp gave in the gallery in 1957, which is about 10 years before he died. And actually, you can find it online in written form, or even I think there's an audio recording of him giving this 20-minute speech. But what is called the creative act. And so Duchamp, who surely must be one of the most interesting 20th century artists who popped up doing so many different wonderful, extraordinary, unexpected things, talking about his own experience of how his work and other artists' work have been interpreted. He says very clearly, we've got to be, we spend a lot of time making something or painting something. And we ought to be clear, most of the meaning is made on the other side of the canvas. It's the spectator that makes most of the meaning. And you need to think about the role of the reader. Don't just think that, you've set some meanings out and they are transmitted. It's I won't spend long on it, but it's a more complicated process, because obviously the meaning isn't arbitrary. You look at a work of art, you're not going to say, well, that is obviously a motor car, unless it is a motor car. But, you're not going to say it's upside down. On the other hand, it may not be the control of the meaning that the artist had when they made the piece, film or canvas or whatever. It's a kind of negotiated version of the meaning that a spectator will have. And take it up, Niall McCann's Can Art Save the World? I'm going to start with a film which is not ostensibly radical. It's actually making a point about another filmmaker, one Alfred Hitchcock, and a Swiss video artist called Matthias Müller, working with Christoph Girardet, the two of them on this project called the Phoenix Tapes, has got something to say about Hitchcock's filmmaking. And we have a look at that straight away. It's, I think, about 10 minutes long. Something.
The first clip that Rod showed was section 4 of the Phoenix Tapes from 1999. The section was titled, Why Don't You Love Me?
So, mustn't descend into train spotting how many Hitchcock films you recognize. I mean, he made about 2 films, and I think there are about 18 in there. Any response or comments about it? You can if you like, or you don't have to if you don't. Obviously, what I'm trying to do is to talk about how an artist like Matthias Müller actually has that thing to say about Hitchcock and the role and theme of the mother in his films. And I found that, in some interview, he talks about, while I collect and sort out the images, an attitude towards the material starts developing. It expands from parasitic nesting in already existing visual material and the uncovering of hidden messages to dismantling and denunciation. I tear the image from its original context, and this strategy, comparative to associative and mercurial thinking, triggers a process of transformation. And I think it's that phrase, associative and mercurial thinking, because, you will have seen that what's happening there is not, some chronological form. He's actually looked at all of Hitchcock's films and grouped the references that he wants to pull into focus around the notion of the mother in a sort of associative way. The telephone, the cigarette, the laughter, the eyes. And that, I think, arguably is not a million miles from dream work. We might, I don't know what you were doing at 3:00 this morning, but I think sometimes the movement through memory and creation in dreams, it takes this form of association and connection, which is not how we are taught to think in the daylight. And, for me, the interesting thing about the short film there is that, what is said could very easily be an academic essay or a thesis or a book. I mean, there's a whole Hitchcock industry. You go into a bookshop with a lot of film books, and you'll see shelves of stuff on Hitchcock. And an essay, say, about the role of the mother would have plenty of footnotes. It would have careful references, and it would get a big tick from someone teaching in a university like this, I would have thought. But what Muller has done is to put together image montage, which I think has a kind of equivalent effect in that, maybe if you're watching a Hitchcock movie on a Sunday afternoon or late at night, or you might pick up on the issue of the role of the mother in a way that you might not have picked up beforehand, and you haven't had to read an academic essay there in a much more lively way. Muller has deployed enough material to at least make the case. I mean, I showed this to someone a week ago as I was sort of thinking about today, and she just said, yeah, but every film's going to be about the mother. Well, you can go on to have other arguments about it. I mean, actually, by pure chance, I was reading a talk given in the train on the way down this morning by Juliet Mitchell, who wrote a kind of pivotal book in the 70s called Psychoanalysis and Feminism, saying, I know Freud was a bit of a patriarch, but he had a lot of interesting things to say that are relevant to feminist theory, as indeed our mutual friend Laura Mulvey would say constantly. She was talking about war and violence and how, hiya, welcome. You missed a clip or two, but don't worry. There's a way in which psychoanalysis is not dealt with in the same way, and it's actually taken refuge in academic work more nowadays. But I think, the Phoenix tapes in that film, throw it into motion in an interesting way. Unless you've got something to say at this point, because you're welcome to, I'm going to move on to a completely different form of film made by Adam Curtis, who I don't know if you've ever come across. He is an ex-BBC guy. I don't know if he's still employed by the BBC, but they're certainly in exile, I think, in Sheffield, basically working on archive from the vast archive of the BBC, doing quite a lot of things about the Middle East. He did something about the fall of the Soviet system in Russia called normalization. What was the thing? Something Blood Lake, which was about, Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. Anyway, this is one of his... Hyper-normalization. You're right. We're going to take two little subsidiary aspects of this in extract. It Felt Like a Kiss that Adam Curtis made in 2009, and the two little chunks of it will go firstly the thing at the front and then spin forward to 1935 and look at that bit there, are again about how his associative montage works in a different way from Matthias Muller.
Next, Rod showed two clips from 2009's It Felt Like a Kiss, the opening few minutes, and then a section on Enos the chimp.
So, it's different, but I think connected between Why Don't You Love Me and It Felt Like a Kiss is a form of mercurial thinking, to use Matthias Muller's words, which allows connection. I mean, it's not completely unfamiliar. If you are, cruising the internet or opening a paper, you might see articles juxtaposed which have no ostensible connection, but you can think, that actually is relevant to that. So here, the opening sets up America to remake the world. It seems, recently familiar in a more horrifying way, but, the use of popular culture in America, with a whole range of registers, music and image, to dominate narratives and set about a way of understanding the world. Consumer culture, in a phrase. And that's the opening sequence. And then the other bit, which quite arbitrarily I picked further in, if I remember it correctly, we start with Enos the chimp coming from the Congo, going into orbit, and then underneath the, like in the novel Orbit, which won the Booker Prize last year, spinning around the Earth 7 times a day, I presume, Enos is going over the Congo, where, the CIA backed a coup to assassinate Lumumba, and also where the hypothesis that HIV came from. And we moved from HIV in the Congo with chimpanzees to Doris Day and Rock Hudson in the back of a car. Rock Hudson, who died of AIDS and who, in his tragic death, obviously outed himself, or was outed as a gay male actor, which he'd managed to his marketing as a star had not mentioned that heretofore. So that's the movement in this film, but in different ways than his other work that Adam Curtis is working with, associating and calibrating different registers and different domains of meaning. I don't want to throw too many polysyllables at you, but a kind of key. I said at the beginning, French theory coming to Britain when I was a student was talking about the making of how meaning is made, the signifier and the signified, and trying to understand all of that. And another key word was polysemic, which means, multiple meaning. Polysemic means the ambiguity of a lot of artistic work, which, unlike most narratives that we encounter, we see about 3,000 images a day, apparently, and most of those images are anchored. They are with words one way or another, on an advertisement or on the small screen or big screen you're watching. And artistic work, which could be called polysemic, is really becoming a kind of more open text and breaking that relationship with meaning. In fact, here's a quote from one of the other theorists of those years, still alive now, Julia Kristeva, who said, "Art is what disturbs or destroys identity, system, order." Destroying identity, system, order. And that is true of most of what we've been watching. To return to filmmaking, which perhaps is nearer documentaries made in many colleges. In fact, this documentary, which was quite successful in festivals, was made as a practice-based doctorate. Amy Hardy made this documentary about, we'll see the beginning of it, which sets it up, and then I'll talking of.
Just before we go,
yep.
So I just wanted to add in this interview you showed the clip from, because when we were talking earlier about Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which was a film which was out last year, which was very much about the coup in the Congo and the CIA's involvement in that, but also how they used, again, thinking about popular culture, black jazz musicians of the age, Dizzy Gillespie, to go to Africa and around the world as these kind of ambassadors of American culture, and how they were basically used to create this identity, American identity abroad, while at home, Rod's kind of just pre and during the kind of height of sort of civil rights, sort of Martin Luther King battles and those kinds of, all those battles in sort of late 50s, early 60s, and how those jazz musicians kind of became really conflicted about that role, but also how they were seen as kind of pawns of the American government, how they were used as pawns, for how their relationship to black audiences and black people back home was kind of really problematic. It's a beautiful film, constructed like a piece of jazz music.
You see, I thought of that when we were looking at that today, and you'd mentioned it earlier. And I think that what we're doing is, Adam Curtis's work, because we're throwing another relevant film into the sort of connection he makes over that. And
this is really important.
And I'm talking about polysemy. One of the American abstract expressionists were marketed by the CIA, who are uninhibited about what art they're doing, as long as it perpetuates the sense of New York has replaced Paris and Berlin. A bit as Trump is saying at the moment, we'll leave Europe, and this is the center of things, because Pollock's action painting becomes something that is. It wasn't financed by the CIA, but exhibitions of it were taken around the world by the CIA. This Amy Hardy's doc, which we're going to see the beginning of, is, I won't say too much in advance. It's quite self-explanatory.
Up next was the first few minutes of Amy Hardy's The Edge of Dreaming from 2009.
Yeah, more traditional in montage style, but the feature-length documentary, very much in the sort of diaristic first-person style, goes on to say, following the shock of the dream in which George the horse dies, she then has a dream in which her first or an early boyfriend partner, who actually is a Portuguese guy at the London Film School with her, appears in a dream, who has subsequently died. I think he's the father of one of the 3 children. But anyway, he's died, and he appears in a dream and says, "You're not going to make it to your 38th birthday." That's it, right? So following the horse's unfortunate end, that really does spook her. And the rest of the film is, she goes to see a psychiatrist, she goes to see, a shaman, she sees a scientist about premonition, she sees a whole range of people, and it all feeds in. Anyway, the film, I'm glad to say, ends with her 38th birthday party. So the premonition not come to pass. And, it's got a lot of interesting movement between these different ways of accounting for stuff. Actually, I was an examiner at her PhD, and this film was part of the PhD, and the only, PhD examinations are often sort of asking for minor corrections. And my minor correction was to say, look, you may be a Jungian, that's up to you, but you cannot write a whole thesis about premonition and dreaming without mentioning the guy who wrote a book about dreaming in 1908 called S. Freud. You don't have to agree with him, but he's part. And when someone's reading your thesis in 30 years' time, they need to know why you didn't want to take it down that road. That's fine, and that all worked out. But obviously you've only seen a little bit of it, but the relevance of this to artistic modes of thought is that it's an audiovisual subjective account rather than a scientific thesis. And in fact, one of the crucial, I think, disingenuous things about scientific theses, and indeed most academic writing, is they do not use the word I. They evacuate the personal. Why have you chosen to write about this? What are your passions? Why are you interested in this? That's a frame around academic discourse, but it's missing. And one could talk more about that, but I won't. But Amy's film challenges the binaries of art and science and opens up a whole. Actually, I can't resist telling you this. When I just been to Edinburgh to examine this doctoral thesis and the film, I then went back to Galway, where I live, and I'm in the supermarket, and I see on this magazine, one of these dreadful. It's called It's Fate, and it's about horoscopes and chat and stuff like that. And I recognized that. I said, that's Amy Hardy. And she actually, fair play for, a student to make some money in any way they can, had written an article called Your Amazing Paranormal World. My ex's ghost told me I'd die. And I think it's called Impact, isn't it? Taking your work out to a wider audience. What?
That's amazing anecdote.
Well, you can imagine I was slightly taken aback in the supermarket to see that, this serious thesis had been monetized in such an inventive way. Anyway, no, but that's the point. I mean, it's fitting into a picture. I'm going to show one last extract. Fitting into a picture of different forms of discourse and what's at stake in them. If you're interested, think more about, journalistic discourse. Academic, I've mentioned, different forms of artistic discourse, the fact check on Trump in front of Congress yesterday. These different discourses, or Trump's discourse. Oh yeah, I can't resist that. Trump, actually, there was an article before he was elected president for a second time. There's an article about Trumpian discourse in all these rallies he was given, where he talked about his free association. And he actually, in a characteristically modest way, Trump said, professors of English are really interested in how I free associate. And there was a big paragraph, one example of his free association, which says, climate change, it's all, it's all blown up and out of proportion, and the planet is not in danger, and these ecological scares shouldn't be taken too seriously. We need to drill, or something like that. And he said, say, for example, you've got to take these batteries now instead of fossil fuel engines. And, you're in a boat with a battery, and then the boat begins to sink. And so, because the battery's too heavy, and then there are sharks in the water. So what do you do? And I think his ability to digress between anything he thought of in a political speech at a rally is... I won't dignify it with the phrase an artistic mode of thought, but it is quite extraordinary. And the last example of artistic mode of thought is I was, Neil mentioned I'd worked for Channel 4 in the first 10 years, and we had a season of early Godard films, and I found myself in the great pleasure of going to Roll in Switzerland by Lake Geneva to see the great man and say, will you make what he made a thing called Soft and Hard for us to introduce the season. And Soft and Hard is a kind of, pun on technology and pornography. And he and Anne-Marie Melville made Soft and Hard, to start the season. And actually, Godard was a sort of extraordinary and mad artist, because he said to me, I didn't spend long enough on this, I could have made it much better. Either I could give you half the money back. I haven't had that said too often by a filmmaker. Give you half the money back, or I could do some more work on it when you've shown it. I don't know how we did it. Anyway, he also said, will you take this back, and had a look at it. And it was a 1-inch tape of the first hour of what became Histoire, with a bracket around the S, Histoire de Cinema, which is a pun on the French word histoire, which is both story and history, which is interesting use of the word, really. And this is just a little fragment of Histoire de Cinema, actually also redeploying a little bit of Hitchcock and other things. And it made me, I mentioned that way back in 81, years before the encounters with Godard took place, and I'd written about his film Numero Uno, and the article was titled "Amongst Godard's Forms of Thought," and it just fascinated me that there's metaphoric thinking, to take one thing and to call it another. No problem. There's also metonymy, which is you take an element of something to represent the whole. There's displacement and digression, use of reversal and paradox, and intertextuality, which is like to pull one text, which is actually what writers are consciously or unconsciously always doing, which is, they swim in a sea of texts, and they are reformulating maybe something new, but it's using other texts. And one, quite poignant example of this was when I was going over to Switzerland a bit to do this. My now oldest son, Adam, was sort of on the way, and Godard was quite interested in this, and in fact even wrote some note welcoming him to the world. And in the film Soft and Hard, there's a bit where he says, I think he's playing tennis in the sitting room with Anne-Marie Melville, and he says, just because I don't have any children does not mean I'm not a human being. And I couldn't help but think that the coincidence of us, having a child had triggered this in him. 20 years later, I found it's a quote from a letter that Vincent van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo. Just because I don't have any children doesn't mean I'm not a human being. So even in that kind of personal, intimate perception, Godard's using a quote, and his films are full of quotes. Anyway, we'll look at and we might even look at it twice. It's only about 2 minutes long, from Histoire de Cinéma.
Next was a short section from Jean-Luc Godard's 1988 Histoire du cinéma.
Peut-être que 10 000 personnes n'ont pas oublié la pomme de Cézanne. Mais c'est 1 milliard de spectateurs qui se souviendront du bruit qu'elle a connu du Nord-Express. C'est un vrai historique et au seul poète vous dire kritakse. Det är parce qu'il a été celui-là in Michel Oberfoss's fictional images. It is this way rare pages that they are in succession. That's where the idea comes from. One section comes up to another. The portraits aren't aware of what we call montage, or in other words, the cutting of one image to another. They go by so rapidly, so that they are absorbed by the content that they look at on the screen.
Okay, Father, we will come back to your thing, I think, about metaphor and metonymy in a moment, if that's okay. But just while that's there, the two things which really jump out in this context are, firstly, there's Godard's voiceover saying forms really tell you what's at the bottom of things. So again, there's this stress on the signifier, not the signified. And so the question of how you articulate, what form of discourse you use, is thrown into highlight by Godard. It's forms at the bottom of things. And secondly, even though he speaks over it, there's a clip from an interview with Hitchcock who says, well, of course, no one notices what we're doing because it's called editing or montage, and no one in the cinema sees the editing, understands the editing. They are in the film, the kind of cathartic process of narrative cinema. And I suppose I'm going to, end with this because it begins to talk about the politics of form and what radical form is challenging in a way, because it's throwing in a clip like that. I mean, it's a kind of outrageous metaphor. He's saying Hitchcock succeeded where Alexander the Great, Hitler, Napoleon didn't, because of the degree of power exerted in 2 hours in a cinema. But, the cinema is one element of an image system. It is one part of a kind of representational process which we live within. And radical form raises the question, is that, or those various representational systems, part of what determines how we see the world and how we live, and the general shit show going on at the moment, I suppose you could say. And the starting point was certainly, in my view, the most interesting writer of that epoch, who was Roland Barthes, who started off a book of short magazine pieces he'd written called Mythologies, and he's talking about everything from Roman soldiers' haircuts in movies to wrestling to Citroen cars and everything. And he's talking about how ideology naturalizes everything. It doesn't say it's a choice, it's a social, human determined choice, it's a natural thing, as in it cannot be challenged or changed. And his line, which I think was on the blurb that Neil put round, is La vérité d'un texte n'est pas la vérité qu'il dit, c'est notion paradoxale. La vérité est de sa forme. The truth of a text is not the truth of what it says. It is, paradoxically, the truth of its form. So all of these extracts I've been showing and the Bark quote are to throw that. I mean, I'm going to go on to Malcolm Le Grice in 5 minutes, but maybe we could look at the Godard again. It's short and rich.
Because it was so pertinent to the talk, Rod decided to screen the Histoire du cinéma clip again.
Mais on se souvient d'un sac à main. Mais on se souvient d'un autocar dans le désert. Mais on se souvient d'un verre de lait, des ailes d'un moulin, d'une brosse à cheveux. Mais on se souvient d'une rangée de bouteilles. Le partition de musique, la trousseau de grès. Parce que, à travers vous, la vécu, passerait Hitchcock réussit la haute choix pour tout César, littéraire d'un côté. L'univers. Prendre le contrôle de l'univers. Peut-être que 10 000 personnes n'ont pas oublié la pomme de Cézanne. Mais c'est 1 milliard de spectateurs qui se souviendront du briquet de l'inconnu du Nord-Express. Et Alfred Hitchcock était le seul poète mondial et le mauvais succès. Parce qu'il a été aussi libéral de son succès. It is this way their baggage they are in succession. That's where the ideas come from. One thing snuffs up to another. The puppets aren't aware of what we call montage, or in other words, the cutting of one image to another. They go by so rapidly, so that they are absorbed by the content that they look at on the screen.
Okay, so sorry to delay you. There was something you were going to ask arise.
It was just literally like this, like the word, the sort of equipment. Moronic, and then you mentioned another.
Okay, well, you put your finger on, I think, an absolutely key concept to understanding the image system. Metaphor is well known. You know, someone with a moustache comes into a Polish movie in a school and he's dictatorial, and all the Poles know he's Stalin because he isn't called Joseph, but they know that that's a metaphor for dictatorship at the time. And you can think of millions of metaphors. Metonymy, I think, is in some ways more key to how the system works, because metonymy is a small element taken as the whole. So you might say, a sail on the horizon. Actually, you mean a boat. Or, you know, the crown has to solve this, meaning the monarchy or the king. So you take an element as the whole. And I think that's actually, you know, there's such a huge degree of selectivity in every choice of word or image, or you switch on the news, you know, which shot from what point to what point facing in which direction and what's said over it. This is a whole process of massive selectivity, which it takes something that you could say is factual towards fiction. I suppose because it's near at hand, I'd say that about Amy Hardy's documentary, The Edge of Dreaming. I'm sure that the horse died, that's her family, that she went to see a scientist and then a shaman. I'm sure it's fact. I trust her. Why not? However, the choice of so many possibilities anyone's making a film is creating, I wouldn't say a fiction, because it's built of fact, but inevitably it's such a fragment of fact. It's equivalent to what we normally call fiction. So that's why I think metonymy is really an important thing. And we're almost ready for something completely different. Well, not completely different. Anything else from what you've looked at so far?
Something else about form, the idea of form. I can't remember what you were saying about I can't remember exactly what he said. Radical form. But there was something about Errol Morris, documentary director, talks about how there's a kind of puritanism about how form is attached to truth. That I think he sort of railed against the idea that observational, not interfering with kind of observation of it. The camera stands back and just observes the truth as if that takes away from the idea of an interference.
I think that's I'd have to look at, I've only seen some of his stuff, like The Fog of War, I think he made, and one or two other things, but I think it points at I mentioned that an academic essay which does not mention the word I is disingenuous. So is a cinema verite shot which says, I am a passive camera just observing, because you observe that, not that, not that, and if I cut because I want to cut your speech, I take a shot at another member of this seminar. Are you smiling? Or are you looking bored? Because it makes a comment on the speech. So it isn't just the choice to take that chunk of words and that cutaway, as it would be called. And I think the, what was it called? Direct cinema in America, and cinema verite in France, is, a very, I think Errol Morris is completely right. It's got something, it's not as obvious as, say, some of the stuff we've looked at this morning, but it's also wanting to give, to enforce what documentaries are trying to say, that they avow the truth. They're telling a factual version, which they may be. I'm not saying they all lie, but it's the way that they do it and how it works.
And I think his insistence on creating a kind of fictional way of approaching fact tries to kind of undermine that idea that, I think he said something like, the font that you write an article in doesn't make it more true. It's not more reliable because it's written in.
But unconsciously, the font works. A kind of typewriter type font is journalistic.
Yeah.
Times Roman has got serifs, and so that's kind of serious and classical and scholarly. There's a very good film, which actually everyone in art college ought to view if they haven't already, called Helvetica, where an American filmmaker talks about the way that post-World War II, a very clean, clear, modernist font called Helvetica from Switzerland began to sweep everything aside. And then it was finally overturned by a kind of grunge period where people were throwing it all in. Your man is right about typography, for sure. There's a Nazi font, actually, called Fraktur, which you recognize it on some of their posters and things like that, which, was a sort of a Germanic font for a time. Bart's point is nothing is neutral. What we think is nature is something that we've called nature. In fact, we've interfered with it so much that, it's also interlaced with cultural intervention, isn't it? When you stand on Dartmoor, you say, "Oh, this is nature." Well, sort of.
But I mean, what's interesting about the stuff that you've shown today, though, is like that eye is present in the fort. So in that, like, it's not just in saying the directly or like I am here. It's seeing the eye in the construction and the choices, and that's that drawing attention to the hand that is making the work. I think is a, because it's always there. You can't hide it. People try, and try and have the subjective, idea, but it's in the work you showed today is kind of like there's an openness to say yes, like Alan Kurtz's work is very much, he wants you to feel the result of his time spent thinking about this.
Yeah, captions and voiceover. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting as well that Hitchcock, great. I was at the Prince Charles the other week in London and saw Northwest on 70mm,
Wow.
which was beautiful.
Is it shot on 70mm then?
The Vista Vision, yeah.
Oh.
So it looked glorious, and it's a beautiful print. But the audience was really young, and which was really gratifying. Friday night at the Prince Charles, really young audience, and really engaged with it. And I find, and hearing Goddard talk about Hitchcock is kind of part provocation. Obviously, it wants you to think about where he's placing Hitchcock and cinema in terms of world history, but also kind of making a case for thinking about Hitchcock in a certain way, which you were sort of saying earlier about how that would go down in a film score. And I think in an art school context, contemporarily, certain figures like Freud, like Hitchcock, are kind of being ushered out almost entirely, because in this idea that their time is done, like the dead white man is done, we've moved on, which I think is kind of dangerous. When you watch something like Off West, you think this is an extraordinarily formal object, and regardless of the privilege to put a white man in a position to do that, the work, like you say, the object separate from that has so much to teach, particularly filmmakers.
And things are always more complex than that sort of narrowing. I mean, one of the interesting new book out about Fritz Fanon, who was an African psychoanalyst, and he redeploys. Sorry, Frantz Fanon. Sorry, that's a Freudian slip itself. Frantz Fanon, redeploys aspects of psychoanalysis to understand colonialism. And I think, I'm coming back to Hitchcock, there was a little piece in an interview that Penelope Houston, who used to be the editor of Sight and Sound, or Slight and Sound as I called it, he did an interview with Hitchcock when he made that last English film and was almost retired. And she said, "Well, Alfred, what is it really all about? What are you trying to do in your films?" And Hitchcock said, "I'm trying to put the audience through it." So that direct sense of power in a moment of a sequence is actually, part of what he likes to think he's doing. It's not just unconscious. And if you flash back to the stuff in Why Don't You Love Me, the range of films, a lot of it is very effective in that way, not just Psycho, Shall we move on to Le Grice?
Yeah, let's do some Le Grice.
I mean, as I said at the very beginning, there's a sort of relevance to Le Grice because of his recent passing. But also, in a way, I'll show you a clip of a film we made in Channel 4 called Abstract Cinema, and we'll see a bit of an interview with the late Le Grice in it. And if you look closely, there's a statuette of Lenin on the edit suite behind it. Malcolm, who lived in Thurleston, I don't know if anyone knows Thurleston, sleepy little town near Dartmouth, described, he used to upset the local retired folk by saying, "Well, of course I'm a Marxist." So he had a left-wing demeanor, and also set up the London, was one of those, I should say, to set up the London Filmmakers Cooperative as an early version of artistic autonomy. I mean, there are galleries now. I can't remember the Glasgow one. There's one in Galway called the 126, which is artist-led, which is not like commanded by the Arts Council or whatever. It's actually run by artists themselves. So in his practice, and also, I mean, he set up the film department in St. Martin's and the University of the Arts in London. You know, in all of this practice, there is a kind of politique, but in his filmmaking, you would not necessarily see that, because we're going to start with Berlin Horse, which can be taken to be one of his greatest hits. It's 9 minutes long, made in 1970 with an optical printer in the filmmakers co-op, and with the soundtrack, which I'll talk more about, by Brian Eno.
For the section of the talk that focused on the work of Malcolm Le Grice, first up, Rod showed Berlin Horse from 1970.
Well, some people, I mean, in the end, when we looked at a few more bits and pieces, I will actually ask you what you made of them, because some people just say, oh, the sensuality of the color, and other people say, well, you know, what's happening there? Come on. So, you know, we can, as long as you're relaxed, we can watch a few of these Le Grice films. Of course, I'm not going to say what it means, because it doesn't. But what I can say is that Berlin is a small village in Germany, not the big city. And on a Super 8 camera, Malcolm was around and filmed a horse going round. And this then became the kind of starting point of a film which played with loops. This was a time where New York minimalists like Philip Glass and Steve Reich were making new forms of minimalist music and using loop patterns. And Le Grice uses the bought cheaply from a laboratory that was closing, the optical printer in the London Filmmakers Co-op, to run different lengths of color filter loops over the loop of the horse going round in a circle. And the interesting aspect of making a film in that way was he is not controlling the parameters. He's setting up a system, and then he looks at it and says, well, let's see what happened with that. And the same with Brian Eno, who has guitar chord going round on loops, different length loops, and therefore interacting in a changing pattern. Let's see how that works. And there are several films, even some later digital films, which, you know, the artist actually frames a system without knowing exactly, you know, what it's going to turn up with, and then decides whether he likes it or not. The other thing which I have to tell you about this was that many years, this is 1970, and, you know, it's on YouTube, and, you know, for those that are going to hunt out, you know, abstractionist work, it's been viewed an awful lot. And we're even going to see fragments of it quoted in a pop promo in a moment. But not so long ago, 30, 40 years after it was made, because as Neil said earlier, I come from Torquay, we were down there, and I went to see Malcolm in Thurleston along the coast, and his rather nice lawn sloping down to the edge of the garden was pitted with molehills. I said, God, they're really ruining your lawn. And Malcolm says, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put sonic transmitters in the grass and play them Brian Eno's soundtrack from Berlin Horse. That's going to drive the mold away. I offer you that. Catch the Sun is, what date would this be? Sort of,
This is
one of their first?
Yeah, so this is 1999, 2000 for Dots. This is,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. So there, this is a music video which, as Rod says, incorporates some of Malcolm's work. Next up was Catch the Sun, which was a music video by Doves from 2000, which incorporates some of the material from Berlin Horse.
Well, the unusual example of experimental film edging into popular culture. I should have said before, the second part of Berlin Horse has these horses coming out of a barn with smoke and flames. That actually is a 1910 film by Edwin S. Porter called Leighton, an American fireman. So from the silent epoch of cinema. And there was a famous conference, which by chance I was at in Brighton in the late 70s, where suddenly the archives around the world put together all their films that they possessed from 1910. It was an extraordinary revelation, the birth of the language of cinema, and really extraordinary, interesting short films made in those early days. And quite a few experimental filmmakers did actually use early film as a reference point. Anyway, now, and we're fine for time, now we're going to go, I said soft and hard, now we're going to go hardcore. This is abstract cinema, not a band playing in front of color, not a horse going round in a circle, but abstraction. And I'm going to look at the beginning of a guy called Keith Griffiths, mostly working in Channel 4. We were responding to other people's ideas. So I want to do a film about X and Y. In this case, I actually said to Keith Griffiths, who is in a company called Large Storm, will you do a film for us about abstract cinema? And we'll look at the beginning with American filmmaker Stan Brakhage, talking about abstraction, and lots of little different abstract film artists. I don't know, we should have, because we had it in the original film, the beginning of Fantasia, because that's one of the most popular. I mean, if you're talking about abstraction in contemporary culture, fireworks, not a lot of it, but it does. Flower arrangement, you could almost say. But then we're going to go into a bit of the interview with Le Grice in there.
Next, there were two clips from the 1993 documentary Abstract Cinema. First up was the introduction section, featuring an interview with Stan Brakhage, and then later on from the same film, an interview with Malcolm Le Grice.
We're skipping arbitrary logic and going straight to finity. Finity was, because Malcolm Le Grice also did work called expanded cinema at the time, but it involves performance with different projectors running color loops, for example. But the focus on one screen meant that someone standing in front of them are creating different through their performance, different forms, and there were a wide range of play with experimental work and performance. Finity is a kind of performance because it was 6 screens wide. In fact, 3 DVD projectors with 2 screens on each. But we're just going to look at some bits and pieces from Finity, which is about an hour long. But we'll look at to show the range of imagery.
Next, there were a couple of sections from 2010's multi-screen installation by Le Grice called Finity.
There's a show on at the Tate Gallery in Tate Modern in London at the moment called Electric Dreams, which is basically electronic art before the internet. And there's a lot of, Le Grice was right in there at the front with using computers. And that abstract film you saw with the apples was done on a home computer, so not expensive, complicated equipment. Using quite cheap domestic equipment, and again generating systems that he would find out how it turned out, this note and that image, when it was finished and when he looked at it, but wouldn't know in advance, if you see what I mean. Yeah, it's really bad behavior with a film to jump into 4 extracts from it, but time is limited. If you've got a moment still, perhaps we could look at least the beginning of Dark Trees, which you've got on file, haven't you, Neil?
Yeah.
Dark Trees, he's finished at the College of Art, finished at the co-op, finished other stuff, and mostly quiet down in Thurleston, although occasionally going out to show the work here or there. Because equipment now facilitates it, still making stuff. And I think in about 2019, I saw this film called Dark Trees, which is basically a drone at dusk in his garden. And he said to me, this will probably be the last film I ever make, complete bullshit. He made another 5 since then.
Finally, Rod shared the opening of one of Malcolm Le Grice's last films, although not his last, which was 2019's Dark Trees. Lovely images to end on. Anyway,
it's a very, you've got to be in the right mood, but it's basically using, as I say, a camera on a drone, which are not too expensive to buy, flying around and superimposing at dusk. I mean, actually, growing up in Devon, it was only when I left Devon that I understood the word my parents used for dusk, crept through school. The word they used was dimpsy. It's getting dimpsy. And so it's a version of Devonian dimpsy, I guess. And as I say, when you're in the right state of mind, it's a very calm and beautiful film. And as they said, it would be his last one, but it was not. Any thoughts or questions or arguments about anything we've looked at or I've been saying?
Made thinking about, saying Malcolm, around about 1970 when he made the first series one. And it sounds to me, is that like Praxis then? Was that sort of that era when Praxis was sort of coming through as, from the Situationists and International? Would that have been that sort of idea? They didn't know what they were going to do, just the balloon, like how I having a go.
Well, it's a sort of second cousin of Situationist Praxis, I think you could say, in that, they would certainly, have a sense of, that moment. At his funeral in December, the undertaker, who had actually done a bit of careful work, mentioned the word. He said Malcolm grew up in the counterculture, as a few years after Malcolm I did as well. And that counterculture was, it had hippiest aspects, but it was, a kind fragments of utopian ideals about how the world could be changed. A bit mystic and, I remember the great slogan, no left turn unstoned, which sort of sums it up in a way. The Situationists were over the horizon in France, but, May 68 confirmed a lot of the ideas of the counterculture with a lot of impact. Could say that, the performance aspects are to keep it short, the basic situationist binary is between a situation which is participative and a spectacle which is, you sit quietly and it comes at you. And Hitchcock is a spectacle, you could say. And maybe some of these radical form examples I've shown you could make an argument to say they are more situational because the spectator has a different kind of role. The spectator is not driven into catatonic unconsciousness, but they're looking and thinking. And, even though something like Finity is quite, it's a huge spectacle when you've got the 6 screens going. But it's so, it's so resistant to a simple narrative that it is drawing the spectator in a way that North by Northwest in 70mm is not, I would say. That's the...
The clip we saw with lots of different screens, okay. And were they an installation, or it was designed to be watched on a screen like?
He actually ran it from front to back, and it was about 60 minutes long, and the imagery, as I say, there are actually 3 projectors with 2 screens on each, but it was like, everyone ready? 2, 3, 1, to get them to start on time. So the choreography of the 6 images, the 3 projectors, but the 6 images, was within a second or 2 controlled.
But was it designed to be viewed in a space, or was it designed to be viewed on a screen?
On a screen, in a space. Like, they showed it, I remember being there for a screening in the Tate tanks, which is the big oil tanks by the Tate Modern. And we actually did a little Irish tour. I was in Galway, and so Malcolm and Judith came over, and we drove up to Derry and bought huge amounts of white canvas that could deal with the fact they didn't have a clean, big enough wall, big enough. So we stretched the canvas out and got the 6 screens on it. But I mean, not only have I, done a bad thing by cutting into little glimpses, but also it's, much too small. It needs to be big, bright, So, yeah.
And the clips, they weren't referencing other films? He had generated.
Yeah, he'd shot nearly all of it, from the sea to the food to the flowers. Towards the end, as I say, there are quotations within it, but non-specific quotations from war on television. I think there's some Second World War and maybe news of more recent wars, maybe. Just like the quotation of the the quotation of the early film is not like about early film but it was like another, having gotten the footage she'd shot of the Berlin horse, here's something else which can go with it.
Right. That was great. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, indeed.
Thank you to Rod for putting that talk together. Thank you to the staff and students who came along and contributed as well. It was a real privilege to just spend a couple of hours thinking and talking through this stuff. So very, very grateful for that in that environment. Dario, what did you want to sort of draw out in terms of the things it made you think about?
Yeah, I mean, it sets up so nicely at the beginning with this sort of dichotomy of artistic forms of thought and what does that actually mean, and set up alongside kind of like simple or regular forms of thought. And again, I'm just worried that sometimes can be kind of misinterpreted in terms of being sort of pretentious and highbrow ways of thinking must require a sort of, a lexicon that is only available to a certain group of, elite thinkers, let's say. But I think actually in this day and age, as he was sort of alluding to throughout, it's almost a kind of radical act, an act of political rejection to say, no, I'm not going to just take the simple passive way of thinking about something. And, those relationships to questions that, like, what is the creative act? And how does, when a piece of art is in the world, then it becomes the property, or it becomes kind of like a communal phenomenon. It's up to the reader and spectator to make the meaning. So there's always a kind of circular, evolving sense of what something is when it's out in the world. And that was just a great quote from Matthias Muller. While I collect and sort out the images and attitude towards the material starts developing, it expands from parasitic nesting in already existing visual material and the uncovering of hidden messages to dismantle and denunciate. And this is the bit again. I tear the image from its original context, and this strategy is comparative to associative and mercurial thinking, triggers a process of transformation. And this got me thinking about both the question of using material in video essays, and generally how much everything that we produce kind of comes from somewhere else. And then, the thinking and the discourses of argument that come up all the time around AI. And that was the thing that sort of got me thinking, because I was just delivering a talk on AI filmmaking, and the questions that you have to answer on that regard, isn't this just all plagiarism? And I think just to labor that for a second, that link to AI and the ideas that this is not just plagiarism, the use of AI, but it's contravening things like copyright law. But even more kind of philosophically than that, it's kind of against the idea of originality and creativity in its essence. And what's funny to me, sometimes I think that actually what we're just afraid of is the scale in which AI can do it. You know what I mean? And like, the program has the power to scan and ameliorate in a way that obliterates our illusions of originality and influence and homage. You know what I mean? Because like we've talked about a million times, filmmakers, writers, painters, they all borrow from elsewhere, but there seems to be a kind of when a human does it, there's a kind of narrativization of adding value in my copying, or homage or parody or intertextuality. I'm kind of raising up the thing that I'm borrowing from. But when computers do it and do it at scale and amalgamate it in patterned senses with a billion other images, it becomes a kind of hyperreal chimera in that sense. And I think that's where the real issues are, in terms of the reasonings why people hate AI in that sense. But I really liked the way that he's talking about that sense of radical form leaving interpretation open. And I've been doing a lot of work with the students trying to explain to them ideas like polysemic interpretation, or polysemic creativity, or we use polyvalent montage in editing. And that advocacy for, not for closed meanings, but associative openness. And it really is a fantastic to sort of hear that kind of spelled out and related to particular forms of art, whether it's, Godard or Adam Curtis. And you mentioned soundtrack to a coup d'etat. And that sense of, as he mentioned, Chris Daver, the idea that art should be destroying identity systems and orders. And that leads to the question, is most of cinema actually art at all? Because if it's not doing that, then maybe from Stoneman's perspective, it isn't art.
Yeah, and I think that that is the question of the moment, isn't it? In terms of like this conflation of cinema and a very, very, very narrow range of output from America, but also where those kinds of contemporary systems, particularly streaming and the internet, in terms of like gatekeeping, curation, algorithms, whatever, and what it's promoting even from outside that space, and how it has to kind of align ideologically or formally with what is perceived as still filmmaking, which is kind of what was Hollywood, but is now I guess an American mainstream industry, which is, and where are those spaces for pushback, and how and how still there are glimmers of it formally, something like the Nickel Boys, but within that context, it's not regarded as valid or as important or worthy. It's just, it's not even that it's not happening. It's that when it does happen, even in those modes, it's kind of brushed aside.
And even, sorry, just to interrupt, Neil, even something like Anora, which won the Oscar, which I do not like. I think it's a very unsophisticated, one-dimensional movie in storytelling and character terms. And here's the Oscars lauding that movie up, and they have nothing to do with it. It's a completely independent production that's produced on a very, $6 million, which is a lot of money, but it's not a huge budget in terms of Hollywood. And it's kind of amazing to me that even something that is not great, that they couldn't produce that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They didn't even produce that
Yeah.
kind of level
Yeah.
of sophistication, because that's seen as too out there and off the wall kind of thing.
Yeah, because it's a kind of, it's a broad comedy about a sex worker. And they've done Pretty Woman, so they don't need to go there again. But yeah, those spaces are much, much harder to find. And it's interesting. The Curtis thing is interesting, I think, in this context, because Goddard is Goddard.
Yeah.
And the other examples are, very, very specific. But Curtis's work kind of sits in a weird space. I wouldn't say he's necessarily well known, but his stuff is widely available in the UK through the iPlayer, particularly. Like it sits there. Any search you do, documentary, film, whatever, like on the iPlayer, like you have the opportunity to see this work, and it's probably not radical in the sense of like it has kind of formal antecedents now in terms of an approach in that space, but it was, and it did take large scale National Archive work and repurpose it in a way which still feels kind of interesting when you watch it in clip form. You're like, oh, actually, there's a lot going on here that feels very, very open in a way that a lot of documentary or video essay work, particularly stuff commissioned at that level, does not feel open. It feels very much like controlled in terms of what the messaging would be. And it's kind of we come back to this all the time. Like it's weird that you say that these things are radical, because to us as individuals, we don't think it should be.
No,
but it is.
Yeah.
And it's weird that it is kind of, and it's Rod's a big fan of Mark Jenkins' work, and we've talked about that in terms of like just it feels different, and it kind of shouldn't. And Mark's had that thing where people sort of said Bait was really experimental, and he's like, really, and we were like, really.
Yeah,
but you're like, yeah, in the context of like 2020 and what passes for a mainstream British film, it is experimental. And you're like, God, that's an indictment in itself, that something which ostensibly is very smart and sophisticated and uses experimental techniques and is very thoughtful, but to just think it's experimental in of itself, it's like, no, because experimental to me is, as Roz talked about, like Brackage or Le Grice, non-narrative, color exploration, not something which has to me a very clear story, clear characters, and a clear telling, even if it's a fragmented and mini telling.
But I think that like for us, we're still seeing we're grounded in a kind of experimental histories, and the knowledge of them. Whereas I think that like somebody who's used to just watching, mainstream cinema and then sees Bait, oh wow, that's so different, that's so radical, and then would watch if you asked them to watch Malcolm Le Grice, it would be like, this is nothing. This is not like I had some like students were saying to me that this isn't even a film. This is just somebody putting random shit together for no reason. Do you know what I mean? It's like but I don't blame them for sort of saying that, because in some senses that there is that it's like, that critique of contemporary art, at times, which is like, oh, I could just do that. You know what I mean? If it's 2 lines on stick it up on the wall there, £1 million, please. It's that sort of thing going on. And also I think that part of it as well is there isn't a commitment to specificity of the form, because everything is content right now. So I tried to get the students, for example, when I showed them a bit of Brackage, literally to stand up. We all got stood up in front of the screen and watched it on the screen for like 3 minutes. So they didn't have their phones and stuff like that, and they were stood up. So it was all like inviting them to physically engage with the text, Right. And what was interesting, after they watched that, and then over the weeks after watching 3 or 4, they started to see the contours of form and what people were trying to do. Some of them did anyway.
But that's great, isn't it? And it is that prolonged engagement, and thinking of it as engagement with form rather than just expecting it to be about content.
Yeah.
So that's great. And again, that was one of the nice things about hearing Rod talk, was kind of just the wider context of his thinking in terms of both his history and his knowledge, but also where this stuff fits in a wider context, and how to approach it without admonishment, which I think is the thing you were saying there, like, and we come back to quite a lot in terms of like, you have to open a door with this stuff with any, but I think the problem is what we're opening the door to just feels wider and wider and wider, because the pre-existing relationship to this stuff feels much narrower than it did even when we were young, which is, again, not the fault of the students who are coming in or people who are engaging with this stuff newly. It is a societal and cultural problem, and it's been shaped malevolently in order for that to be the case. When I sort of see the stuff, much less interested in the Oscars than they used to be, and part of it is because like, it's not just what's included, it's the conversation about what's included, about what's not included. It's non-existent, and it's like, well, okay, if we can't talk about this stuff, like, it's never a truly representative list, blah blah blah, but they felt like there was more engagement with a critical discourse about it than now. And it's just like, well, this is where we are, and it's like, well, these are the films, and you're like, that's not a film culture I want to engage with, even if I don't like the films, and I never really like the films. It's more about, can we find a way to see what they're doing? Where is it interesting? Where are they formally Nah, none of that. Which does move us into other spaces. And again, one of the things I was thinking, actually, there's loads of Curtis work I haven't seen. And that talk that Rod gave, I was, and if you're going to share links, obviously, with everyone, but it was like, actually spending more time with Malcolm Le Grice's work, I'm excited about those viewing experiences. Which is, again, part of the reason to put all this together. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And just a great talk, which I think what's interesting is, it'd be fascinating to hear what any of the listeners think in terms of, for us, this particular format, having the live kind of talk, and whether it kind of works, because you have to be, as a listener, I think you have to be slightly patient. So well done to everybody who's kind of got to this point of the of the podcast, but I think it rewards those people who've kind of engaged with the build up of what is being said, for sure.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, thank you all for tolerating our forays into new radical forms.
For sure. Yeah. Well, the next episode is actually just a load of sounds of me and Neil trying to plug in our audio equipment and not saying anything for 4.5 hours. So that's the next level to come.
And it's non-linear as well, so you can't even tap into it that way. Yes, inspired to get ever weirder. So yeah, thank you for that, Dario. I'm glad it kind of resonated. I thought it would. Rod was proposing it, and then when he did it,
no, it's great.
So yeah, we'll be back soon. We've got lots in the pipeline, loads and loads of stuff. So I don't think the next gap will be as long as this one, since the last one, but who knows? But we have got a lot of stuff coming up. Polish animation, a screening of Oliver Stone's The Doors, and then some filmmaker interviews as sort of some films come online for release in April and May, and some other stuff as well. And I'm visiting London next month. So Dario and I are going to do some taping there as well, which I'm looking forward to. So yeah, thanks, Dario. Hope you have a good weekend and a good week when this one's out in the world.
Thanks very much, you too. And yeah, look forward to more tapings and getting stuff out for you guys out there.
So yeah, thanks again to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers for your loyal support and for going with us on this journey. We appreciate you greatly. But for now, this has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.